This project deals with remembering 30 years after the breakup of Yugoslavia. Maybe from your perspective, what do you think? Why did the situation in the end escalate? Like, what really happened? I mean, this is still one of the things which are not really, there is not this one truth until now. How would you assess this?
Well, of course, we know that any big event in history has been in the past and also today, like World War II, the origins and so on, even World War II, one should say, has been discussed in a rather controversial way. Yeah? And in the case of Yugoslavia, of course, where such a multifaceted reasons and deeper and more actual historical, political, economic reasons play such a big role, it is even more difficult. But I believe that one has to think of a bridge that collapses, and it is not because one pillar is bad. It is a combination of several factors that cause such a collapse of a bridge. And this is, for me, a metaphor for Yugoslavia. I mean, it was, of course, the fact that this is a multi-ethnic empire, actually. And at the time of the end of the Cold War, it was the greatest concern was really addressed to the Soviet Union, that a war would break out if and when there is a implosion of the Soviet Union. It did not happen there, but it happened in Yugoslavia. And again, the reasons are highly complex. It's economic reasons, but in my opinion, it is interesting enough a constitutional reason. The Constitution of 1974, the Yugoslav Constitution, gave the republics a lot of autonomy. And whenever there were reform movements, they took place in the realm of a republic, which means reformers automatically identified with a certain national identity, which then in turn became a nationalistic and ethnically based ideology. And so instead of working to establish or to rebuild in a democratic way a Yugoslav identity, where there were identities based solely on the republic's Slovene identity, Croat identity, Serb identity. And this is clearly a TNT, so to speak, for any multi-ethnic state. And then we also need to keep in mind that the geopolitical situation with the end of the Cold War has produced a result which was in a way unexpected. And that was Yugoslavia basically became irrelevant for the West. Yugoslavia as a non-aligned country, as a barrier, so to speak, between the Soviet Union and the West was not necessary any longer. So economic support stopped, political support stopped, and nobody really looked into the question because everybody was concerned about the Soviet Union.
You were a High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina. You also were European Union Special Envoy for Kosovo, all in the 90s, end of 90s, beginning of 2000s. How did you perceive then the reconciliation process after all those atrocities, what happened in the region?
It was quite interesting that by the fact that the war was stopped from the outside, it created a situation where everybody felt either a victim or a victor, or even both. Yeah? And I believe this is the worst possible precondition to create an atmosphere of reconciliation. You first need to work in terms of on your own position. What was your contribution to this disaster, to this conflict? And only then one can take the next step. But it was basically the conflict was frozen by external intervention, and then the state-building process in each of the respective republics took place, and so it was actually identity building on a nationalistic, on an ethnic basis, where the other simply did not factor in. The other was automatically the enemy. And particularly when it comes to Serbia, the largest ethnic group in former Yugoslavia, Serbs were not limited to the borders of Serbia. They were also in other republics. And so there is this kind of fundamental confrontation between leading a nationalist politics based on ethnicity and at the same time trying to incorporate from other republics the ethnic kin. And that, of course, is a blueprint for disaster.
You probably also were a little bit referring to what happened in the region when it was forced from the outside, probably also to the Dayton Agreement, which just celebrated in December its 25th year of accomplishment. Still, it is very much contested, especially also these days. We were hearing about a non-paper of a non-author from probably Slovenia. Nobody really talks about it that much. But you also had like other ideas of Vučić and Taci to reshape borders between Kosovo and Serbia. Do you think that these are big obstacles when it comes to the reconciliation process, and also even looking furthermore to the big goal, which is European Union integration at one time?
Well, all these non-papers clearly demonstrate that the ethnic thinking in politics is still very much around. Yeah? The real transformation that took place in Eastern Europe with the help of a very strong, democratically oriented dissident groups and a dissident elite, almost intellectual, dissident, democratic elite. This did not happen in former Yugoslavia. It was really the kind of thing that only happened within a republic, and therefore these leaders who would have had all of Yugoslavia in view, so to speak, this was not the case, and therefore everything that followed was only consequential, because you cannot really build a state, a multi-ethnic state, on an ethnic base. And when it comes to border changes and all this stuff, in the past, historically speaking, borders in the Balkans, as maybe also in other parts of the world, were always changed by force. Yeah? And this kind of attitude is still very much around, and people believe that this could be a solution. However, when I talk about, and you mentioned the Vučić-Taci proposal, so to speak, it was very vague. In fact, I was talking to both sides at the time, and I was one of the few who said, well, actually, if we want that ownership takes place in the region, there has to be a buy-in. And if they believe that they could exchange some territory, which is absolutely a no-go for the West, then they should produce a more detailed proposal, which of course never happened, because I'm convinced that first of all, we need to see to it that there is an engagement for a solution, for a compromise. And on the other hand, we need to see to it that we make clear that a state in the Europe of the 21st century cannot be based on ethnicity only. Of course, ethnicity is part of it, identity is also part of it, but the democratic framework has to be the first and foremost principle. And the will of the people, of course, also. Decisions about border changes in the past and also in these non-papers, they have not spoken with any of the affected citizens. So this is definitely not a solution.
When we try to talk also about reconciliation, many say that reconciliation is a process which takes for generations actually to be accomplished at one point. How important do you think is political leadership in this? And do you see that the political leadership for this goal is actually already there in the region?
No, it's very unfortunate. You need two to tango. You need a citizenry which really is ready to make the step towards the perceived enemy. But above all, in order to initiate such a reconciliation process, you need a political leadership, you need political and intellectual elites who really and sincerely want to do this. Now, the time factor is decisive. Only recently, the Germans, after more than 100 years, formally recognized the genocide in Namibia from their colonial past, more than 100 years. We are maybe also, when we talk about reconciliation, a bit too forceful. Unless there is something in these respective countries, in terms of NGOs, in terms of active citizens, citoyens, this is never going to happen. Reconciliation has to come from those who are directly affected, were directly affected by the conflict. Think of Europe. I mean, for hundreds and hundreds of years, European nations have fought each other. Only after 1945, the French and the Germans decided, let's put a full stop to this kind of confrontation. But the first step was taken by the top political leadership in both countries. And I think this is what is still missing here. And therefore, we need to support grassroots movements from the outside. We need to be very clear with the politicians and the political parties in these countries that unless there is a move towards reconciliation, everybody is going to be negatively affected. And this is not just a question of a moral or ethical question. It's also an economic and above all a political question, and it is a question of democracy. Liberal democracy is something which is built on the respect for the underdogs, the minorities, and liberal democracy has a great respect for the past.
You mentioned the role of civil society, which is quite important, but also not only of organized civil society, but also of what you call citoyens. How would you assess then also the role of media and free media? Because we also know that this is one of the biggest challenges, not in all of the 6 Western Balkans countries, but specifically, for example, Serbia is very much criticized for its limitations of press freedom. How important is free media and press when it comes to a process of reconciliation, in your opinion?
Clearly, I think we don't have necessarily to look so far. We see so far away. We see this in our own country. You need free media, and there's always going to be the boulevard. There's always going to be the yellow press. There's always to be the journalists who have been bought by the powers to be. So this in itself is just a fact of life. Yeah. But what is concerning me is this kind of overpowering force of media who are controlled by the state. This is something where we need to work on, and there I believe civil society is indeed very important. You need a critical public, basically. But as long as there is a very social crisis and economic crisis, free media are not of the greatest concern for the citizens. They want to have a job, they want to have a survival kit, so to speak, provided by the governments. And then sometimes they take non-free media just simply as something which exists. And then there's of course also manipulation. You know, many people simply because they are not so educated, and I'm including Austrians there as well as in many Western countries, people do not have a know-how when it comes to what is the role of media, how do we deal with the facts. And in the age of social media, it's even worse. So we have a very weak media situation in the Western Balkans on the one hand, and now even reinforced by the social media, which clearly blossom there, which clearly are very detrimental to a positive development in the media scene.
The Western Balkan countries are often referred to as that their future is within the European Union, and nobody actually within the European Union, no state actually challenges it. It's sometimes about procedures and about timetables, and there is this idea that the countries need to be reconciled before they are ready to be integrated within the European Union, and there's this other idea which says the idea how we can be reconciled is once we are entering the European Union, because then we do have like the supranational organizations and we can reconcile while being in there. How would you assess this?
Well, reconciliation is really a precondition. Not a fully, it's more about the process. It's more about the first steps into the right direction. Because you see now, I mean, it was particularly Slovenes, but also Croats who said we cannot live in this Yugoslavia. Well, as you can see now, they have sovereign states, yet historic conflicts continue to exist between the Slovenes and the Croats. They need even an arbitration in order to have a free access to the sea on the part of Slovenia, and Croatia with I don't know, well over 1,000 kilometers is kind of picky about it. It's not about the real issue. It's about this kind of spirit. Are you ready to accept your neighbor as a with a full respect or not? And the same between Croats and Serbs, who was always some sort of a historic conflict. Well, I mean, when you look now, the conflict has not eased. Of course, it has eased in a way, but it is still there. So unless there is this readiness to reconcile and to have a fresh start without forgetting the past, to have a fresh start into something which really means a European attitude. That's not around yet, and it will help the process of negotiations, accession, and so on. But as we know from other countries like Cyprus or whatever, between Bulgaria now and North Macedonia, you can see that attitudes don't die and are miraculously removed just because I'm now a member of the European Union. So we need to work on several levels. And reconciliation is this kind of overarching idea. The success of the European Union, the start of European integration, is intimately tied into the French-German reconciliation, and the same will happen in the Balkans when Serbs and Croats and Slovenes and Macedonians and of course this kind of little Yugoslavia, which is Bosnia-Herzegovina, when they feel that they belong together in many ways and that there are small differences, okay, but in the end we live in the same territory, we have the same past, so let's look together into a common future.
The European Union has and had strong ties also financially, economically into the region. It was always there. If you look at it, it's the region is encircled with European Union countries. But there are other actors already a little bit jumping in. I mean, I speak about Russia, I speak about China and the Emirates. But nevertheless, European Union is also not really good at public diplomacy. So how do you assess the situation when it comes to other foreign actors? Is this a challenge for the European Union, or do you think that the region will stick to the values the European Union is actually founded upon?
Well, I believe that this is at the core of European integration, that we have as of late actually two competing models inside of the European Union. The liberal, democratic, so to speak, the original idea of European integration. And since a few years now with Poland and Hungary, we have an authoritarian, or what they call an illiberal democracy. And now, considering the history of the Balkans, I'm afraid to say that actually if these countries would join now, which of course is fiction, they would rather strengthen the authoritarian mode, so to speak, in the European Union. This is something which we definitely do not want to have. But just to let them be outside is also not a solution. And when you talk about the non-traditional external actors, China, Russia is more traditional, but the Arab states, I think it's very important to impress upon the citizens and to work as much as possible with the like-minded in the region that liberal democracy and rules-based work in the European Union is the model that needs to apply. There is no alternative to it. This kind of principle needs to be reinforced. But as long as the European Union is dealing with Orban and Ms. Kaczynski and some also in Bulgaria or Romania, as long as the traditional political parties, European parties, are looking away when it comes to transgressions, then this is not going to work. How should the European Union be taken seriously with the proposal, you guys have to live according to our rules and regulations, if we, the members of the European Union, don't stick to it? So that's, in this way, there is an interconnectedness that needs to be taken much more serious, in my opinion, than it has been taken. We are not going to be very credible if we say, okay, you now do this the way we want you to do, and they again can ask, now, which model actually are you promoting, or which models actually exist in the European Union?
When we talk about reconciliation, we often hear that emotions play a very big role. And you already said earlier about this, either you're a victim or you're a victor. And there is also this competitive victimhood, which is also prevalent in the region. And this also fuels the nationalism. Do you think there are some strategies to overcome this, and what could it be?
Well, to address directly the things that have happened, the terrible things that have happened there, I think this is very important. And I myself was involved in the creation of the Memorial Center and the cemetery in Srebrenica. And I was the first in the international community to call it a genocide. I think this is, you need to name names, you need to do something, and you need to move towards the victims and survivors. That's a first and very important step, the recognition of what has happened. The second very important thing is to fight impunity. You need to work, and therefore ICTY is so important, although it has not delivered everything, but nevertheless it is very important, the Yugoslavia Tribunal. And the third thing is to see that you support the creation of a critical mass of people, of citizens in the respective countries who speak up for this, for reconciliation, and who do not put away simply what has happened in the past. But we know, again, the time factor is something which we sometimes underestimate. It will need generations, yes, but this is not the problem. The problem really is it has not really started yet in the region.
How important would you say is also personal exchange within the region, free traveling, which is not always the case? It's a little bit more difficult for Bosnians to travel, for example, I think to Kosovo, and also for Kosovars. I mean, they can travel to Serbia, but it's a little bit more complicated. And this is one of the great achievements, which we are very proud of in the European Union, is the free exchange, of course, of financial means, but also especially of people. How important would you think is this for reconciliation?
Well, it has to, what you need is really a single market, a regional single market. But when I say market, I mean the exchange of people in a human and humane sense. So youth exchange programs are extremely important, and the Berlin process has produced actually one of the most successful innovations there. people, young generations need to meet each other. They need to not just get together and have a conference, but maybe also work in the respective neighboring countries and so on. So, and then again, you come to the infrastructure, to the physical infrastructure. When you travel in the region, you realize how difficult it is to get from one place to the next unless you have a car. And that's not really what we want. We want a much stronger communications infrastructure, both when it comes to the technical preconditions, as well, of course, when it comes to the human traveling, so to speak. That's, I think, very important. And then single market, in fact, and there are some ideas around. I think this needs to really be pushed very hard. We need to engage and get the governments to create their regional single markets or single market, whatever, mini Schengen and all this stuff. Every idea in this respect is an idea which needs to be put into working. That's something else. There's a lot of talk, there are lots of plans, but then the follow-up really is not there. So I think the European Union can do more to encourage to get governments to do more, because it needs to be very clear to the region, to the citizens, as well as to the political establishment. Regional single markets, regional cooperation is a precondition. This is how you learn how to cooperate once you have reached the European Union.
You mentioned how important it is also for the youth to exchange, to work together, but we also know that one of the biggest problems is also let me even call it an exodus of the young people leaving the region. So my last question would be, why is reconciliation that important until now, and what would be your wish for the next 10 years for the region?
Well, actually, when I worked there was a lot of hope around. When I was the High Representative in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is now around 20 years on, there was much more optimism, much more hope, and of course, therefore, also much more progress in terms of reform movements. It was also that the supporting governments, the European Union, the Americans, were much more engaged because there was a positive engagement, and that has unfortunately died. Many reasons for this, not the least that now, a quarter of a century after, or 30 years after the start of the war, we are encountering other problems, much bigger ones like climate and so on. So maybe one way would also be to engage these countries in those issues that are close to our heart. We know that some of the worst polluted cities are in the Balkans. So why not get them into this climate engagement that the European Union is doing? This would also mean that we're doing something for us and they are doing something for themselves. So this, I'm sure there are many, many other issues where this kind of connectivity to the benefit of both sides could be brought to fruition, and this, I think, should be the future of the region.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang Petritsch, for this very interesting interview.